Commitments were made as part of that declaration, but the key commitment on this slide is number 2. Some of you will remember that the original Carbon Clever vision was for a carbon neutral Inverness and a low carbon Highlands by 2025, and members of the council have now recommitted to achieving that target. However, for the avoidance of any doubt, that is an area-wide regional target rather than a corporate target just for the council. Now, the other key commitment from my perspective on this slide is number 4, and the members were and are right. Climate change isn't a problem, nor should it be, which is left just to the local authority to solve on its own. It requires a collective approach, especially in a region of our size, to avoid wasted and duplicated efforts, but also to make sure we're delivering the right solutions for each community. Now, just in terms of the goal of achieving carbon neutrality, before we can start creating a costed and evidence-based pathway to achieving that, we need to know what our baseline level of emissions is. So to that end, we recently completed a greenhouse gas inventory report for the whole region, which is the first such document that's been produced for Highland. And that report has given us a breakdown of emissions sources and sinks for the year 2018, which has further been broken down into the 6 areas which are highlighted on the map on the slide. Now, without going into huge detail, the net emissions figure for the region, when we consider both sources and sinks in 2018, was around 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's fair to say we've got a fair bit of work to do before we get to net zero. And I'm happy to share that report with anyone who might be interested, and I'll pop a link into the chat later on. So essentially, that baselining work enables the council to make more evidence-based, informed policy decisions in respect of the climate change agenda across Highland. But just before I move on, it would be remiss at this point not to point out the sequestration potential of the region, both through forestry and peatland, and the contribution that new onshore and offshore wind will make to the continued reduction of the carbon intensity of electricity across the whole of the UK. And we're also likely to be one of the regions which benefits most from the emerging hydrogen economy. And there's a growing feeling that the region really needs special status in this regard to reflect the disproportionate contribution that we're going to be making to Scotland's net zero ambition. Now, just in terms of the council's own corporate emissions performance over the past few years, we've seen a clear downward trend in emissions over the lifetime of our current carbon management plan. And that's been a result of both council action on each of the areas which are scoped into the carbon management plan, but also as a result of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. However, we do need to accept a couple of fundamental realities. First of all, the council's own carbon footprint only accounts for around 2.5% of the region's total carbon footprint. And secondly, the majority of the quick wins within our own corporate estate have already been taken, and reducing the remaining 40,000 tonnes of carbon which we emit annually is going to require a fundamental shift in how we deliver services and much better partnership and project working. However, the need for a positive economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic really provides us with an ideal opportunity to tackle this head on. Now, this slide just gives a brief summary of some of the key work streams which are currently underway at the council, and I'll focus on a couple of these for the remainder of the presentation. I'll not say too much about the programme alignment or Highland Adapts work at the moment, because I'll focus in a bit more detail on those shortly. But in terms of energy, which makes up around 75% of our corporate carbon footprint, the council is currently managing the largest SALEX fund for a local authority in the whole of the UK. And that fund is predicated on achieving carbon emissions and cost savings. And the really good thing about it is that 75% of the savings that we achieve through decarbonisation projects are recycled to allow us to undertake further decarbonisation work. So effectively, that becomes a 15 or 20-year programme of work to decarbonise the authority. Now, over and above that, we've got an ongoing programme of solar PV installations, both roof and ground mounted, across the estate, as well as low carbon heating upgrades. Now, we've also recently developed a draft food growing strategy for the region titled Growing Our Future, and this is currently open for consultation. Now, we recognise the need to support local community food growing for the huge variety of benefits that it brings both to individuals and to communities. So if you have the time, we'd really welcome your views on that strategy. And again, I'm happy to post a link to the consultation in the chat. The consultation will close at the end of February 2021 after the conclusion of the Highland Good Food Conversation events in January and February. Now, although it's quite challenging in the current climate, we are developing a variety of behaviour change initiatives with the aim of upskilling our staff and our pupils in respect of the climate and ecological emergency. And that's with a view to reducing not only the council's carbon footprint, but the wider region's footprint as well. It's easy to forget that we're an organisation of 10,000 staff, and those staff have a much wider reach than just the Highland Council estate. Therefore, we're designing our behaviour change tools in a way which will help staff have wider conversations with their family and friends and look towards the right kinds of initiatives at a very local level. And just finally on this slide, my team's responsible for the rollout of the publicly accessible EV charging network in Highland, which is a programme funded by Transport Scotland. Now, there's no question that decarbonising transport is going to be a fundamental part of the overall pathway to getting to net zero. But I don't think that this is going to work or have much positive impact if we simply look to replace all of our existing petrol and diesel cars with electric alternatives. I'm really interested in the opportunities that shared asset electric vehicle car clubs could provide to communities across Highland, not just from a carbon reduction perspective, but also to keep more money in people's pockets. Now, from my perspective, one of the most important pieces of work at the moment is Highland Adapts. We know that even if Scotland and Highland meets emissions reduction targets, there's a significant degree of change already locked into the climate system. It's therefore essential that we begin to properly prepare for that, and we're going to do that through Highland Adapts, which is a place-based partnership approach to adaptation, which is going to be very much rooted in the needs of individual communities to help us develop an action plan which will allow the public sector to continue to deliver services through increasingly extreme weather events, but also to increase the resilience of communities. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, the impacts of climate change have already been felt across the region, from damage to infrastructure to disruption to services and a shift in growing seasons. And work in Highlands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will obviously contribute to limiting the extent of future climate change, but we can't turn back the clock, unfortunately. So past and present day emissions mean that the rate of climate change is going to intensify over the coming decades, and we need to start planning and adapting to that now. So to deliver that, what we're doing is delivering a cross-sector approach involving multiple partners. And whilst the principles and benefits of a place-based approach to adaptation are well established across Scotland, the unique characteristics and the size and scale of the region will mean that we need to take a very much more tailored approach, which draws on the successes of other places but adjusts them to our own local contexts. So I'd like to now just briefly talk about our programme alignment work. So back in February 2020, we commissioned the Sustainable Scotland Network, Practically Green and Wood PLC to examine the three key strands on this slide, which is focused on how we could better match the ambition set out in the Scottish Government's programme for government, and to provide a report which sets out some key actions both internally and with partners to put ourselves in a better position to attract funding for low carbon projects. And a critical aspect of this work is around the natural asset base of Highland and how we as a council can better utilise our own estate for carbon sequestration, whilst also working with partners to expedite projects which are going to help deliver a net zero region quicker. Now that work's identified some key structural challenges which we need to address organisationally before we can start to think about how we move forward more positively. But from a personal perspective, one of the best outcomes of this work is that it has it's provided an arm's length appraisal of where we are as a council, highlighting what we're doing well, but also where there's significant room for improvement. And that will give us a better opportunity to make the changes we need to become a really true low carbon leader within Highland. Now, alongside the programme alignment work, we've built up a picture of what isn't working and what needs to change. And really, this is about applying structure and control to our processes. And we're treating this as three independent bits of work, looking at the problem from end to end. First of all, we're setting out a vision for climate action. We've not really had that previously to help guide our works and our funding bids, and that's hindered us to a point, and we know that from feedback from funders. But by agreeing and finalising a vision, we'll have a point of reference and something to substantiate our proposals and our bids. And establishing appropriate project and funding governance is really important in implementing that vision and ensuring that we deliver on our promises. We need that to ensure that the limited resource available within our team focuses on work that aligns with the vision. So in short, we can't afford to be wasting time on projects that aren't going to deliver both for the council and for the wider region. And then there's improving our funding bids and better understanding what's out there and how we best access it. And I'll talk about that in a wee bit more detail later because it does directly relate to community action in Highland. We really need to build up project initiatives and ideas that are going to allow us to be proactive rather than reactive. So on the left of this slide is an output from a workshop we had with officers recently. And this is really laying the foundation for our new approach and really applying some structure to help us agree what we can or can't do as a team. So we're looking to find the right balance of ambition and pragmatism. And that becomes even more important given my new role to help my team, to help our senior managers, to help our elected members, as well as the communities of Highland, to give them confidence that we're taking a structured approach to climate action. Now, firstly, it's vital for us to get the structure of the team and the appropriate governance processes right from the outset. Otherwise, we'll just hinder progress and waste time. And what I need to do over the next little while is develop this strategic control plan, which we're calling it, alongside my team. I'm just new in post, so I've got a big job to get to know them all, find out what the various skill sets are, and work out where collaboratively we've got the biggest carbon reduction opportunities, both within the council and across the wider region. And just to reinforce that point, by setting a vision for what my team is here to do, it's absolutely vital. Getting that right at an early stage will give us a point of reference, which we just haven't had so far. And moving on, we recognise that community engagement has been a real challenge for the council, especially given how small my team has been over the past few years. It's literally just been myself and one other officer. However, my new role and the vacancy that's created will allow me to recruit a new officer who's going to be primarily focused on community liaison with a view to identifying key ways the council can support climate action at a local level. Now, over and above that, we'll continue to liaise with and expand our network of community groups. And it's fair to say one of the most positive conversations I have on a monthly basis is with Anna from Planet Sutherland. And I think it's fair to say we've both benefited from that two-way conversation and finding out what's going on in our respective patches. Now, in addition, responsibility, as I've already mentioned, for the publicly accessible EV charging network sits with my team. And we've got a really dedicated team who are delivering that work and who are keen to hear from communities around their individual charging needs so that we can help to properly scope that and build into future funding bids. And I think it's also really important to give community action a voice in the political stage. And to that end, I'm really supportive of allowing specific groups or projects to highlight their good work to our climate change working group. Now, that's been a really positive forum since we established it back in 2019, and it's a great way to draw attention to so much of the good work that's going on at a community level right in our doorstep. And finally, my team's also responsible for the delivery of a number of government-funded programmes, such as the Energy Efficient Scotland Area-Based Scheme, which delivers funded insulation central heating opportunities to fuel-poor households. And we're really keen to maximise the uptake of those opportunities, but recognise the need to communicate that more widely and in collaboration with partners like Home Energy Scotland. So that's really been a whistle-stop tour of some of what we're up to. From my perspective, it's a really exciting time for climate action, both at the council and throughout the wider Highland region. And I appreciate that I've not been able to go into great detail on anything in particular within this presentation, but I'm more than happy to take questions now, or if you'd prefer to drop me an email after today's event, please do get in touch. So thank you very much.
And so what I'm going to do today is give you the tiniest little taste of the activities from the 6-session Carbon Conversations series. And so we just have time for a dip in to a couple of the things. Both conversations have a variety of activities to engage people in a gentle, supportive, and I hope somewhat spacious way. One of the things that I've worked out over the time I've been working on this is that people need time and space to consider these issues. Just saying to people, you must recycle, you shouldn't fly, isn't enough to affect change. It isn't enough to get people interested. People need a bit of time and space. So I'm going to give you a little tiny bit of time and space here. In a minute, Joanna is going to put you into pairs in breakout rooms. And this is something we do in the first session of Carbon Conversations. Just talk to each other about, I want to take action on climate change because. Hopefully you enjoyed having a chance to chat to each other. One of the things we have in Carbon Conversations is a series of games. So over the 6 sessions, 3 of the sessions have a game. And over this year, we've transferred those online. So that's the next thing I'm going to share with you. And I need 4 people to help me out, please. So because there's so many on Zoom, I can't see you raise your hand, but I'm just going to ask you if you would like to help to unmute yourself. And this is the food game. And when we're looking at the carbon footprint of food, we have 4 areas we can look at. The carbon in production, so everything that happens on the farm. The carbon in processing, what you do in the factory or the preparation area. Packaging, what it's packaged in. And transport. How does it get from the farm to the processing place and finally to a shop near you? So normally this board wouldn't be filled in. We'd start with a blank board, but because we just have a little bit of time here today, I've filled some of it in already. This is the highest amount of, oops, something weird happened there. There we go. This area is the highest amount of carbon emissions, and this going down the scale would be the lowest. So in the processing area, making and freezing chicken nuggets is the highest carbon emissions of these food types. And the processing of a strawberry is the lowest, where things like making beer and wine and cheese are in the middle. And ketchup, which is an incredibly complicated little substance, is up toward the top. If we had more foods, these would be spread out across the spectrum. What I'd like to start with is getting some input from someone about where you think the production of Irish mature cheddar cheese would fit on this chart. So that's what happens on the farm. So basically, making the milk, growing the cow. So where do you think it would fit on this spectrum?
Near the top, 1 or 2.
Okay. And how about if I just tuck it there and we can move it if we need to? Thank you. And oh, interesting. This is a good next one to have. Frozen chicken nuggets from Thailand. Oops, move it down there. More or less than the beer, more or less than the cheese. Anybody?
I think it's more than the cheese.
Okay, anybody else?
Sorry.
No, that's okay, thank you.
I would say it'd be less than the cheese.
And the reason for that is?
Because it largely stems from the carbon intensity of the rearing of beef to make milk. That's the fundamental driver for cheese, whereas chicken isn't so carbon intensive to produce.
Yeah.
But it has come from Thailand.
Yeah, it's been on a plane.
But we're not on transport yet.
Yeah. That we'll discuss that when we get to transport.
Well done.
So what if that was beef rather than chicken?
Then it would be higher.
Okay.
It would be higher.
Right. I've got to stick up for non-meat eaters here.
So speaking of transport, chicken nuggets from Thailand, frozen chicken nuggets from Thailand.
I would expect that to be top of the transport.
Yeah, high, top.
Because it's a long way and because it's frozen?
Yeah, frozen.
Yeah. Okay. Noting that the wine comes a long way too, but it doesn't have to be frozen. Yeah.
Also, don't they bottle wine in this country from New Zealand?
they might do, and that then.
Yeah.
But now we have a little fly in the ointment.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this one?
That'll come
I-
in Spain.
Yeah, it's high. It's got to be air freighted.
Mm.
Be at the top, your
Top.
number one.
Should I move chicken nuggets down? Yeah. They probably come by ship because it doesn't really matter how long they're frozen for, unfortunately. Okay, time for one more, I think. The production of organic tomato ketchup. Now we can ignore the plastic bottle for the purposes of this. What do you think?
I'd say near the bottom, it's tomatoes, basically.
Yeah. And yeah, so we'll just pop that in there.
Probably some sugar and vinegar as well, but yeah.
Yep. Yes, it's a complex little product. Okay. Yeah, we've got time for another. Here's a good one. Locally brewed beer in an aluminum can above or below the bottle of wine. So basically an aluminum can versus a glass bottle.
I would say above, but there's less aluminium in a can than there is glass in a bottle, so it's a difficult call.
Yeah.
If
It
it's
really
not
depe-
recycled, I think the
Yeah.
aluminium is more.
It really depends on if it's recycled or not, because I mean, you can save so much energy by, particularly with aluminium, can you?
Yeah. And this is precisely the kind of conversation that we have, only we spend about 50 minutes on it, on all these food types. So just for the avoidance of doubt, that actually goes there, even if you count recycling.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop there. That was, as I said, the briefest of little tasters. And we have a little bit of time for questions. I'll just share this quickly. Is the future worth a conversation? We would say yes, always. Again, because of that time and space. I'll give this to Anna to send out to you all. Things that we can help you with at Surefoot, or even just have a chat with you about for you to do yourself. The Scottish Government's climate conversation is a very good way to get people just started talking about climate change. Carbon Conversations is a bit more of an ask because it's 6 sessions of 2 hours. But again, a very good way to get a group started on acting on their own footprints. And importantly, people gain confidence and skills to talk to others.
So moving on, now we have Bobby Jones. I've been privileged to work, well, not work with Bobby, but to be on the receiving end of a lot of information with respect to resilience, both through COVID and climate change. So I've been to several workshops, and I've just found the thought processes that Bobby goes through amazingly helpful. So Bobby from Freewheel Coaching will take over now, and I'll just leave you to introduce yourself a little bit more, Bobby.
Thanks, Anna. I'm not sure about being on the receiving end of something. I'm not sure if that sounds a good thing or not. We'll see. We'll maybe do a little poll later on. Hi, yeah, so I'm Bobby, and as Anna said, we met a couple of times over the course of this year, mostly as a result of what happened with the pandemic and COVID. Because I don't work in the field of climate change, although it's an issue that's important to me, as it should be to everybody. But it's not the field I work in. I work more in the field of behaviour change, learning and development, and co-creation. And some of the work I do is for an organisation called the Social Enterprise Academy, and they set up in the aftermath of COVID and the pandemic, during lockdown, these peer response groups to get people together to think about how the whole situation was impacting them, maybe ways forward, or at least to provide a bit of a support network for that period of time. And since then, all of the Social Enterprise Academy programs and all of my own programs have moved online completely. Used to be in the room with people, now you're on a screen with people. We've got used to that gradually, of course, over time. But what I found is since lockdown, almost everybody wants to talk about two main things. They want to talk about change. What is change? Why does it affect us the way it affects us? How could we maybe cope with it better or understand it better? That's the joy of working from home. And also resilience. So what is resilience about, and how can resilience help us with change? And what does my resilience mean? What's resilience in terms of communities? What's resilience in terms of teams working together? So a whole pile of questions around resilience and how we build that. So in terms of my involvement here today, it's made me think about when I was doing a master's a while ago. So originally my professional career was in outdoor education, and then it was in social work. And I was doing a master's in social work, and I had to do a dissertation as part of that. And I decided to be lazy and do a dissertation around things I already knew quite well. So I was looking at outdoor education as a social work intervention. So with young offenders or community groups or whatever. And what I discovered when I did the literature review for that was that actually those two sets of expertise and research that had been done and all the knowledge that had been gathered did not talk to each other at all. They were two completely different sets of research, with sometimes drawing similar conclusions. Sometimes one side held one kind of key to the whole issue and one side held a completely different key, but they didn't really talk to each other at all. So the conclusion of the whole thing was more like, hang on a minute, why do all these disciplines sit in their own silo and not talk to each other? So the thinking behind this little section today is not that I come with any expertise at all on climate change, but that maybe there might be some things in change theory and or resilience theory that might be useful, or a starting point for thinking about how they might apply or be useful in terms of working with communities on climate change. So it's that bit about not working in silos all the time and trying to kind of nick bits from anywhere else that might be useful, that might help us with some of the complex problems that we face at the moment. So I've got two things to share with you. I haven't got a pile of time, so I'm going to share one theory or model around change and one theory or model around resilience, and then give you a bit of time in smaller groups, hopefully about 10 minutes, to chat about the implications of those two, if any, what might be useful, what might be something that might be applicable to working with communities on climate change. So that's the plan. First of all, I'm going to screen share. So this is the first one. This is the Kübler-Ross change curve. So some people may have come across this in different contexts before. It's a different thing to the loss version of this, but it's the idea about how humans tend to respond when a change happens, usually a negative change, the process, the emotional process that we go through, the psychological process. So I'll chat through it and then we'll have a shot at doing something with it. So usually speaking, when the change happens, people respond initially with shock or surprise at the event. And quite often for folk after that, there's a period of denial or disbelief, looking for evidence that this isn't true. So as you're looking through this, think about COVID, but also think about climate change and how this might apply to the way people process changes. So folk in denial, disbelief, looking for evidence that isn't true, perhaps latching on to conspiracy theories, perhaps latching on to alternative scientific or other than scientific evidence around something. But that's all about trying to maintain the status quo. How do I not have to engage with the fact that there's a change or a serious thing that I need to consider here? And folk may stay in that for a very short period of time, or they might stay in that for a longer period of time, depending on how they deal with that part of the curve. Beyond that, as people start to accept the reality of something, other emotions and feelings can creep in. So they might involve frustration, they might involve anger, they might involve pushing back against the change or the situation. Usually fairly high energy feelings, but not necessarily very positive feelings. And beyond that point, as people start to accept a change and accept that perhaps anger and frustration aren't going to do anything about it, lots of people will then experience a lower mood period of time, low motivation, low mood, possibly depression in that sense of low mood for a period of time, apathy. Beyond that, if people are able to get through that piece, the next stage is experiment. So that's about starting to engage with the new situation. So trying things out, having a shot at stuff and seeing what might work, perhaps building new skills, perhaps building new networks or communities, if that's part of it, trying things out. And then over a period of time of doing that, we start to settle on the things that are working. So what are we going to keep? What's working best? What do I feel most comfortable with? What do I feel most skillful at now? And making decisions about what to keep in place. And ultimately, that leads to integrating those changes and those things into our lives again. And we enter what, what is called the new normal. Folk have banded that term around quite a lot. I'm not sure we're, in relation to COVID, we're quite there yet. But the concept of new normal is basically we get back onto a status quo even keel, back to a place where we feel we're operating as we normally do. So that's the curve as it normally is presented. In terms of COVID, this has an application, but we need to remember that actually the situation with the pandemic isn't one change that's happened that we're responding to. It's multiple changes in multiple areas of our lives that are still unfolding. And so as you think about yourself in relation to your experience of the pandemic and COVID in this change curve, it's unlikely to be a linear process where you've moved from one to the other, and you know where you are on that line, you know what you've encountered already, and you know what's coming next. Changes in restrictions, changes in what's happening in the outside world are likely to throw us about this curve a fair bit. So you might have been experimenting with stuff and feeling more confident, then the restrictions change again and you're back in frustration and anger, possibly even denial, and you might move about in a less linear fashion on this little curve. In terms of climate change, it might be slightly different, and we'll find out a little bit in a minute. So what we're going to have a shot at is using the annotation feature on Zoom. If as I chat through it, it's not working for you, or you're not sure how to work it, especially if you're on a phone or an iPad, it might be a little bit trickier, or perhaps it's just you can't find the things you need to find. Don't worry, there's loads of folk here. So the exercise is more about populating this a little bit, seeing how it shows up. It's not necessarily necessary for you to be able to put it on there yourself, but have a think about where you would put yours when I ask you the question. So to annotate, if you are on a laptop or a desktop, you need to put your cursor up towards the top of the screen where you've got an options or review options button. And you click on that and you'll get a little drop down menu. And one of the options on there will be annotation. So click on annotation. And once you've done that, you get an extra little toolbar pop up with a whole pile of options, a bit like a 1990s computer desktop design type program. And one of the options on that toolbar says stamp, and it's got a tick above it. And if you click on stamp, you get a variety of little stamp design options drop down. And so we're going to use all 4 of these to mark our place just for today on, or other people's place on this little curve. When you do mark your place, try and not cover up the actual words so that we can still see them for later rounds. So the first round is about your personal feelings around where you're at in terms of the pandemic and COVID. So having talked about the caveat that it might be different today than it is tomorrow, and you might move all over the place, just for today, just for now, I've anonymized it, so no one's names are going to pop up next to it. So if you're happy to, and you can find stamp, and you've managed to find one, could we pick, oh, hang on, let's go. All right, whatever, pick whatever stamp you like, fire it wherever you like. Okay, so for those that can, I'll just give us a little while to choose a place. Brilliant, okay. So a bit of a cluster around decision, a few folk feeling more like they might be into a new normal. Some folks still in that lower mood, or perhaps those are more kind of difficult to feel feelings a little bit further back. And it could be that these change at the moment on a daily basis. It might depend on the area that you're in, what the restrictions are, might depend on other areas of your life and what's going on in there. So it's going to be in different places for different people on different days. Second topic, so if we move away from the COVID pandemic and we start to think more about climate change. So first of all, climate change and you. So your response to and thinking around climate change, where would you be at the moment? So add another stamp, maybe pick a different one so we've got a bit of variety. Add a different stamp on this curve for where you feel you would be in relation to climate change. We've got some people off the chart.
I'm holding this so that I can listen to it. It's an event that I was attending, but
is it on now?
Yeah. But
Just managed to mute myself then. So third one, climate change and your local community. From what you know of your local community, where's your sense of where the local community would sit on this curve in relation to climate change? As it's starting to look very pretty, isn't it? But also what we're noticing is, particularly in relation to the last two questions, there's maybe a little bit of a difference between where folk, or most folk here, would place themselves and where they might place their communities. So just take notice of that, because that's an interesting thing in and of itself. Let's go for the government. We'll go for Scottish Government rather than local government, particularly as Keith's here. So for Scottish Government and climate change, where does it feel like Scottish Government is at the moment? Where would you pop your stamp for Scottish Government? So as people are populating this one, we're seeing not only shift in terms of where the Scottish Government might sit, but also real variety in terms of how people feel where Scottish Government might sit, which is interesting as well. Again, we've got some off the chart. And here's the last one. So international, let's just go sort of international at the political level. Where does it feel like the world at the international political level is in terms of climate change? This is quite located in the first section of that, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, again, quite different. Brilliant, thanks folks. That's lovely, that's much nicer than it was when we started. Thank you. But yes, that says a couple of things, doesn't it? And I'll leave you to discuss this in more detail in your smaller groups, but it talks about how we experience things differently, but also how with an issue like climate change, people are in really different places. And that might have implications in terms of how we engage with them, and also what might be needed at that particular part of that change curve for this particular model. Here's a second slide of it. Oh, I'm going to need to get rid of my drawings. There we go. So here's a second slide of it. And this slide has got a little bit of a sense of what these different stages are. So what the state is, and then underneath which parts of the curve that applies to, and then what the approaches in general might be for these different stages. So if you've got folk who are in the shock or the denial space, that's really about status quo. Things haven't changed much yet. It's about trying to keep things the way they were, and not having to engage with the change too much. And so at this point, the most important activities are around communicating information. If people are still taking on board the implications of something, or very much in denial around something like climate change, what they need is information. And you know that you guys will know much better than me the different ways of doing that, but that's the focus for folk that are in that space. For the second piece, which is around the more tricky emotional responses, so the disruption bit where folk are feeling perhaps a little bit unhappy and a little bit discombobulated, or maybe, you know, a lot of both of those things. The reactions might be anger, frustration, anxiety, and apathy in those spaces. And the responses need to be more around watching, listening, supporting, engaging with folk, understanding where they're coming from, in order to help people settle some of those feelings. Because if we can't settle some of those feelings, it's harder for people to have headspace to engage in trying stuff out. And the next stage is exploration. So that's around acceptance has settled in, perhaps some of those trickier feelings have settled down a bit. And now, and this reminds me of what Pam was saying earlier about time and space to explore and to test and to feel your way through and to try things out, to see what works and what works for you. And then beyond that, once we're into the decision-making, integrating phase, we're on rebuilding, and the stage is commitment to the new thing. And there it's perhaps important to not forget to celebrate stuff. And someone was saying something earlier about positivity and optimism. That might have been you as well, Pam. Being able to think about the things that have gone well and celebrate and acknowledge those as well. some folks still annotating as we go here. So it's a great skill to use on Zoom. Cool. Okay, so that's our change theory. I'm going to chat us through briefly our resilience theory and then pop you into your breakout rooms to have a chat about those and how they might apply for your own contexts. So our change theory is around resilience. Resilience theory is obviously around resilience. Resilience definition, first of all. So when people first started talking about resilience, certainly in the social work world that I was involved in for quite a while, it was very much focused on individual adversity and sometimes really extreme adversity and the mechanisms by which people could bounce back from that adversity or cope with that adversity. And I think more recently, we've broadened out that definition quite a lot. So although that might be the case and a relevant part of the exploration of resilience, there are lots of other applications of it as well. So resilience can be about overcoming past misfortunes, perhaps some act of adversity, but it can also be about steering through everyday challenges. It can be about refocusing and moving on when events take us off course. And also, if we're in the place where we can, being open to new experiences and challenges and the learning that come with them. The really important things about resilience is it's not something people just have or don't have. And this is true of communities as much as it's true of individuals and teams as well. It's a learned and it's a learnable ability. It's not just about how you respond to adversity, but how you respond to change of any kind. And it's not just about bouncing back to where we were before, but it's also about growth. So the idea about when people train for sport and they're building muscle, they put their muscles under stress and then they have a recovery week or a recovery period. And during that recovery period, it's not just about stopping exercise because you can't do it anymore. It's about giving those muscles a chance to not just regenerate, but grow stronger so that next time they can cope with that same level of stress even easier than they did before. So there's something about resilience that's also about building in periods of recovery for growth and being able to cope with things better than before as well. So I've had a shot at fiddling around with something to create some community resilience factors. So these aren't the ones that you might find in research that's specifically looking at community resilience. They tend to focus on infrastructure type stuff like that Keith was talking about earlier, rather than perhaps behavior change stuff. And so these are adapted from a piece of work by Amy Grayson on high performing resilient teams, but thinking about that stuff in relation to communities. So it's a shot at it. So it'd be interesting to see what you guys make of it in your discussion. So here are 6 factors that feel that they're in line with other factors around resilience that might be applicable for community resilience and might also have implications in terms of engaging with communities on climate change stuff. So the first one is shared mission, vision and goals. So that's about community members knowing what this or they are, contributing to them if at all possible, because co-creation is so important in engagement, or at least aligning with them. The second one's about strengths, skills and resources. So that's that balance around local knowledge and resources being identified and being utilised, but also being prepared to consider what additional expertise and resources might be needed for a particular thing and sourcing them as well. The third one is about relationships, which is key to all resilience theory stuff. So community members feel a sense of belonging. There are social supports and networks and effective communication to maintain that sense of belonging. The fourth one is around empowerment. And Russell commented in the chat earlier about this, and we were in a breakout room together, so we talked about it a little bit more. The community is engaged in a way which allows everyone involvement and agency. Co-creation of solutions wherever possible will help to develop this. And there is a sense of responsibility and accountability. Everybody has a part to play. Empowerment and engagement are so important in getting people together around a thing and finding ways for that to happen. And Russell was talking about the concept of recycling and people having that sense of agency around, I'm doing a thing and I'm contributing a thing to this, even if the area of recycling itself isn't perhaps as critical to climate change as some other actions that people can take. But it gives people a sense of commitment and agency in making change happen. And then we've got this fifth one here, positivity, things around attitude. And Pam was talking about this stuff earlier, gratitude, a community culture of optimism, positivity, celebration of achievements. And that attitude stuff, that positivity stuff being a really good route into engaging folk as well. And flexibility is the final one. So the community is able to flex and adapt to change. There's a culture of creativity and problem solving in the face of challenges. So solution focused approaches rather than always deficit focused approaches. And the community is able to change or develop its collective thinking and approach as required. So there we are, 6 thoughts about 6 areas of community resilience. So the idea now is to pop you guys into some smaller groups of about 4 or so to have a chat about these, or basically as we were chatting through those things, what popped up to you? What made you think, oh, that's interesting, that might be something I can use, or oh, I want to chat to someone a bit more about that. So be curious about what you've heard and chat about it a little bit more. I've got a question for you that I'm popping into the chat. It's quite broad. What might the implications or uses be of either or both of these models for working with communities on climate change? So basically, what popped up there that you thought was interesting that you might be able to use in some way? The point of the community resilience stuff is about if communities are building those 6 factors and some other things as well, I'd imagine, to become resilient communities, then we know that climate change isn't just about trying to change people's behaviour, it's also going to be about coping with what comes with climate change. If those communities are in a resilient place and they're connected and the relationships are strong, then the chances of being able to cope with, adapt to, change with that stuff, you know, are definitely elevated. Plus that whole bit about mission and vision and purpose. It's about trying to get around something, isn't it? And as we were talking to, Pam was talking about earlier, people will have different motivations and different priorities in terms of why they want to take action on climate change. But what we're trying to achieve together as a bottom line thing is the unifying piece, which is part of what creates resilience, having a unified aim and a goal together, so that when we're under pressure, we're able to look to that rather than be dissipated by the impacts of the pressures. Anyway, enough of that for one day. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hand back to Anna. You know, this is the kind of conversation that can run and run, but I suppose it's just an encouragement to look at all different kinds of disciplines and areas for things that might help us with this stuff, because complex problems require, you know, complex solutions, and there's a lot of information out there, but it sometimes sits in silos and we don't get to access it. So that's my piece. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Bobby. That was fascinating as usual, and I think everybody will be ruminating about the various different concepts. And yeah, so thanks very much.